All right, today we have another episode from the archives with one of my incredible guests. Enjoy. Welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast, a show about the incredible people dedicated to helping those who have experienced trauma. My name is Guy McPherson, and my mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to inspire each of us to help those around us. All right, welcome to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson, and this is the podcast where we interview master trauma therapists from all over the world to learn about what inspires them and the steps they've taken to become masters in their field. If you're a trauma therapist, if you're interested in trauma therapy, or if you're simply passionate about helping other people, this is it. Today, I am so excited to introduce my guest, Dr. Chris Courtois. Chris, are you ready to go?
I am.
All right. So Dr. Courtois specializes in the treatment of trauma, particularly for adults experiencing the effects of childhood incest and other forms of sexual, physical, and emotional abuse. She's worked with these issues for 30 years and has developed treatment approaches for complex, posttraumatic, and dissociative conditions for which she's received international recognition. Her new book, Spiritually Oriented Psychotherapy for Trauma, edited along with Donald Walker and Jamie Atson, is available now at Amazon.com, and she has an additional book, which we'll talk about shortly. Chris, I've told our listeners just a little bit about you. Take a moment, let us know something personal about yourself, and then we will dive in.
Okay, something personal is I originally come from the state of Rhode Island. I was raised there, and so my accent sometimes gets muddied, and people think that I come from New York.
Okay.
But I live in Washington, D.C. I've been in private practice for better than 35 years now, specializing in working with adult survivors. I've also run an inpatient unit for adult survivors for 16 years. And currently I'm a clinical consultant, national clinical trauma consultant to Elements Behavioral Health, which is a relatively new health organization, and we're putting trauma-informed care into addiction services for that, for the whole organization.
Great. Okay. So great introduction there. So this podcast is about getting to know, seasoned clinicians with the goal of inspiring other therapists. In order to do that, we first start out really with hearing what's inspired you, what's kind of influenced you along this path. Share with us, Chris, if you will, a mantra, a quote, whatever it is that's guided you on this journey.
I have many that I can offer you, but one that I live by is first, do no more harm. I think that we really have to recognize as we do this work that we're dealing with individuals, and especially with interpersonal violence, that we're dealing with individuals who have been profoundly injured by other people. And so it is a very sacred obligation to us to do the work responsibly and ethically so that we're not causing additional harm to people who have already been injured. Which isn't to say that we're not going to make mistakes as therapists. I'm glad you're asking about those kinds of questions, but it does mean that we really need to be mindful of the population that we're serving and not adding more to their burden. And, consumers have told us, consumer clients have told us that they've been hurt by mental health professionals, and that's one of the things that inspires me is in training professionals is to help that doesn't happen again.
So first, do no more harm. All right, break that down for us, Chris. When did that first, become resonant for you? Tell us a story. Take us down to a ground level for us. Why that quote?
Well, because I had been hearing since the start of my career, and even before I started seeing these clients clinically, my dissertation was an interview study of adult survivors of incestuous abuse, and many of them told stories of being mistreated by individuals in the mental health profession or the medical profession who were unaware of the role of psychological trauma. And unawareness is one thing, but there are also practitioners out there who really don't like this population or have stigmatized them. Many of them have often have been labeled as borderline or even bad borderline clients, which is an indication that there's something wrong with them and they can't heal. And so it's really added to the burden. And we know that healing is possible. And there are approaches that are now called trauma-informed care approaches to the population that really offers them respect and understanding and information about their condition rather than, really stigmatizing them or putting an additional burden on them.
All right. So that's exactly what we need to hear, just to get more specific about, what's kind of informing you. Again, This podcast is about highlighting your journey to become a master trauma therapist. People enter into this field for a variety of reasons. You just mentioned why, or an instance of some clinicians not wanting to get into this field for a variety of reasons. Myself, had a lot to do with my brother coming back from the special forces with PTSD and me not knowing what to do, but really kind of screwing it up. Tell us a story, Chris. Break it down for us. What got you into this field of trauma?
Well, it's a pretty interesting story. I got involved. I went to the University of Maryland for my graduate training, and at the time I was training to be a college administrator. And I was putting myself through college, through graduate school by working as a dorm director. And an unfortunate series of incidents happened while I was a dorm director that were extremely traumatic and traumatized me and everybody who was around, but it actually gave me my start. So I like to say that I got into this field by backing into it. But the events that happened on campus were there were a series of kidnapping gang rapes the year that I took over the dormitory, and one of my staff members was unfortunately one of the victims of that traumatization. And there was very little information available on how to help rape victims at the time, but the movement was taking off, and the DC Rape Crisis Center was founded that very year. A number of us at the university were outraged by what had happened to a number of women, and we decided to develop a rape crisis center on campus, and actually I believe it's the first campus rape crisis center in the country. And while we were working that hotline, we started to get calls from women who were not being raped as adults, but were being assaulted and raped in their homes. And all of these events sort of reoriented my career leanings. I found out that I was a good listener, that I had a lot of empathy, I got a lot of good feedback. And so I changed my major from administration to counseling, in counseling psychology. And when it came time to do my dissertation, Lenore Walker, who had just finished her pioneering study of battered women, was actually on campus for a meeting, and I was talking to her, and I said I was casting around for a dissertation topic, and she said, well, why don't you study these women who are calling? But I couldn't study adolescents at the time, but what I did was decide to do an open call for women who had incest experience who would be willing to talk to me about it. Now, this was really radical in those days, obviously, and these were the very early days. And my committee at the University of Maryland, I was so fortunate because they decided to let me do this dissertation, which was a qualitative study, an interview study, and they set some parameters around it, which is that every question that I asked, I had to tie into the literature. And so it made me search very widely through the incest literature, and surprisingly, there was one. I never would have expected that, but there was quite a voluminous literature, and it was mostly in social work and psychiatry and child welfare, and not in psychology. So I ended up interviewing 30 women. I ended up later repeating the survey and had some male victims as well. And that really set the course for my interest in this population. There was a lot of attention at the time being paid to children and children who were being abused in whatever way in the family, but there was less attention being paid to adults who had already gone through the experience, and that became my area of expertise. In the mid-'80s, I felt that somehow I had a book in me about this topic, and I approached publishers. I again got lucky, and Norton, an editor at Norton, Susan Monroe, took me on as a brand new writer. She had no reason to suspect that I could write, and took me on. And it took me a number of years, but I ended up writing the book Healing the Incest Wound. It got published in 1988, and it turned out to be a 300-page tome. And I was still in graduate student mindset, and I never expected that anybody would read my book. Much less that it would become well received and sort of a classic in the field. So this is a long story, but this is how I get into the field.
No, it's actually a great story, and it's exactly what we're kind of looking for here. I mean, I think that's just amazing how you talked about starting off at the University of Maryland, hoping you're going to be getting into college administration, and then you're profoundly impacted by these events. Mm-hmm. I mean, just these serious kind of horrific events, let's call them what they are. And specifically one which affected one of your staff members. And you said that you were outraged over what happened. And was that kind of the fulcrum on which everything shifted for you, this outrage? Or, I find it interesting that, we start a journey, and something shifts and causes us to shift gears a little. You talked about being a good listener and finding out that you were really a good fit for this field. What was that point that switched for you internally, do you think?
It was that point of outrage and really learning how commonplace rape and other forms of sexual assault were, and even being even more outraged by incestuous abuse, because not only is an assault, but it's an assault by someone related to the victim, and it's a lot more complicated. I mean, I certainly have learned a lot more since then, but in the early years, we were, we did not have a good basis of understanding it. And so we're talking about stranger rape, and then all of a sudden we're talking about rape by family members. It was exponentially that more outrageous, or that much more, disturbing. And then, if you don't even go that far, if you look at the statistics of rape on campus that started even back then, there's a 1 in 5 chance for a woman to be raped during her college career. Okay. And that is just an astounding statistic. And, with all the attention that's being placed at a rape on campus these days, that statistic has not changed in 40 years. Oh. It's really remarkable with all our efforts, and that makes me outraged as well. It is, and that word outrageous, in a sense, is really one of the impetuses for this podcast. One of my roles is working in a clinic. We see a lot of kids with early psychosis, and we get these calls day after day after day. And, not surprisingly, most of these kids have been abused, and there's trauma. And what is going on? Right. That really was the emotion behind doing this. But, I really appreciate you kind of elaborating on that. So, we talked a little bit about your journey, Chris, what led you into the field. Now let's focus on, an early clinical error. Share with us, quote unquote, a mistake, an error that happened for you, and really maybe what you learned from that, how that influenced you. Excuse me. Okay. I think it's a kind of error that influences all novice therapists, and can be even more so for novice therapists dealing with trauma, and that is over-involvement and rescuing, and also getting too close too fast, trying to help, by trying to fix it. And I think my major clinical error back then was in working with someone who was very highly traumatized, both in the past, but had a lot of present-day problems going on, and opening everything all at once and going along with her desire to treat the incest while the other things were going on. And it was way too much, and I was way too involved in her life. And I didn't have major boundary violations, but there was way too much contact and not enough attention put on self-regulation and slowing down and sequencing. The word sequencing is not in my first book, and it was only in 1992 when Judy Herman published her book, Trauma and Recovery, and several of us had finally gotten it by then, that we realized that the work has to be really very mindfully paced, and that you can't do it all at once. And if there are other traumas or other life stresses going on, that those kinds of issues probably need to be addressed first before you do anything else.
So you mentioned over-involvement and rescuing and kind of going too fast. So with this one particular client that you mentioned, was it that you just started, seeing this individual and things just took off, first session, second session, and you just got caught up, like you said?
Yes.
Yeah.
She was in such bad shape early on, and really I didn't have the clinical experience at that time, but I started seeing her 3 times a week to support her, and then there were multiple phone calls in addition to 3 times a week. And since she was dealing with current events as well as the incestuous past, and her past was really complicated and severe, it was really overwhelming her. And instead of slowing it down and really pacing it, we just went forward, and she ended up, and this may have happened otherwise, she ended up being hospitalized a number of times. She actually was the impetus for our putting together, an inpatient program that specializes in working with adult survivors. But, I think we could have possibly saved her from some of the additional pain that she went through. Now, I've talked to her about this, and she says, oh, no, it was right on when we started, and I needed all of that attention, and I do believe that. But I also believe that if I were to do it, a case like this again today, I would do it very differently. And I would pay much more attention to setting foundations and setting limits on what we were talking about, and really helping her stabilize her current life before moving into working on the incestuous issues.
And, I think you're right on the money when you said that this is, an error or situation that many therapists get into. And certainly many of the individuals I've had on this podcast have said something, very, very similar, if not identical. Mm-hmm. And it's always interesting to then draw the kind of distinction between, that kind of error and then the experience that's involved to be able to manage that same situation, right? Mm-hmm. To be able to manage and to hold the boundaries, to be able to sequence, to be able to engage with the client, and let them know that there's a pace here. And that talk to us about what's involved, what it takes to do that. You said if you were going to do it again, you do it much differently. Yeah.
Well, I talk to clients very directly now about the sequence treatment model and why it's so useful and what we're wanting to do, and actually why we want to lay a base, a foundation, especially of the ability to handle their emotions and emotional regulation, and not having a variety of crises or current stresses going on at the same time as they're doing work that's going to be daunting. I talk to them about very deliberately wanting to maintain their functioning. And so we do it in a, approach, avoid kind of way. I also make clear that I think that PTSD is now identified as a condition that involves considerable avoidance, and that we are going to work against the avoidance, and that's part of what we're doing, but we're going to do it in a modulated approach avoid kind of way, and we're going to try to work it to their tolerance and work on building their tolerance skills and their ability to stay self-regulated as they handle the material that comes up. So all of those things are discussed ahead of time. I also personally have limits and a lot more boundaries and limitations, and I'm also very happy to say, and I found that this works because in my own private practice, I may have to hospitalize someone maybe every 5 years, and that is very reluctantly. I don't want to hospitalize, and I want people to be able to do this work on an outpatient basis, and have been successful in being able to follow this model and keep people from being hospitalized.
Okay, awesome. Thanks for that explanation there. So now we get to one of my favorite questions. We talked about some of the challenges of the specialization. We talked about what kind of inspired you to get into the field in the first place. I also believe it's really important that we know why we're doing something, because the answer to that, in a sense, guides us along in our work and what we do. And this is a little different than the question that what led you into the field, but share with us, Chris, why you're doing this on a day-to-day basis. What's your why?
Well, it's very related to why I got in the field, but it is it's on a number of different levels. Directly with the individuals that I work with, the why is because I think we're making a difference, and we're giving an opportunity for healing where there might not have been one. But as you know, Guy, I'm very active at the professional level, nationally and internationally, with trauma societies. And, that takes up my time as much as anything. And my reason for that is because I firmly believe that many of us who are, you're calling us the pioneers or senior folks, but, many of us who've been in this field for a long time, we made the mistakes. And I really feel like new therapists don't have to make the same mistakes that we did. And that this is another ethical imperative, that those of us who have gone through this have a responsibility to teach up-and-coming clinicians not to make the same mistakes, including helping novice therapists not, flail around in the deep water until they've learned how to swim. And it's a metaphor I use with my supervisees all the time. So I've been involved in calling for the inclusion of trauma in professional training across the board, across all professions and at different levels, starting at even the high school and undergraduate level, as well as in professional training. And I've been active in working with the development of competencies, what knowledge and skills bases are needed in order to do this work. And the way it works now, unfortunately, is there are so many trauma survivors, as you were suggesting with your own population, there are so many trauma survivors who are in clinical populations that, by default, trainees and novices are going to be dealing with them. They're going to be treating them. And it's sometimes the case that they get the most difficult cases. And they don't know because they haven't had any training. Yeah. And it becomes in the trench training, which is really a bad way to train. So I really, my passion is to really move the field along in terms of incorporating what we know into psychology, psychiatry, all the mental health and medical professions, so that there's a lot more understanding and a lot more, professionalized and competent training of the treatment of our clients.
Well, I really love what you're saying here, because obviously, you're touching upon your work in a kind of micro and macro way, on the national and international level. You have your private practice, and yet you're very involved with the national societies and helping to integrate and implement, trauma-informed programs, which is really inspiring to me. And this is kind of a perfect segue into the next question, which is, advice for early stage trauma therapists. Many listeners here are seasoned therapists, yet they don't have that trauma experience. Many listeners are just beginning their foray into the field of therapy and are eager to learn more about trauma-informed practices. What advice, Chris, would you have for individuals such as those?
Well, I would have a couple of things. If they don't get training in their professional curriculum, I think it's absolutely essential to get training elsewhere. And the good news about that is there are beginning to be training programs that are online or that are accessible in different locations that are organized and that lead to certification. So that can be done through the professional societies or organizations like the Trauma Center in Boston and the University of Maryland in Baltimore. There are very organized sequences of courses on topics related to trauma. Also, I think that beginning clinicians need to be very curious, do a lot of reading, get yourself a mentor or get yourself a support group or a consultant, because, what we teach clients is doing their work and connecting with other people. And I think that it's imperative that we do that as well for ourselves. And a specific recommendation I would make is do not do this work solo. It's really important that you have people to hold you as you're doing the work, because the material that comes up is often shocking. Some of the interactional styles of traumatized people can be very upsetting and, can push you beyond your limits and interfere with your ability to, have good judgment, perhaps, and, get involved in dual roles and, there are a lot of challenges. So the more, and James Chu, who's a psychiatrist who's been a mentor of mine, Jim has said it's not that you're not going to make mistakes, but knowing about the mistakes ahead of time are going to help you to get out of them a lot faster and realize what's going on. So, at the educational piece, the knowledge piece, getting support, all of those are really important.
Okay. And all of this is going to be available on the show notes page at westcoasttraumaproject.com. Hit on the podcast tab and scroll down to Chris's podcast. So great advice. I think you covered probably every possible conceivable piece of advice there, which is great. Appreciate that. So let's get into some go-to books. I know you just published 2 books.
Yeah.
So talk to us about those.
Well, I just published 2 books last week. It was a red letter week. I've just written a small paperback that may be of interest to clinicians and consumers. It's called It's Not You, It's What Happened to You. And it is available on Amazon. It's just 100 pages, and it's designed to really be oriented towards helping people to understand complex trauma and what treatments are available and how to access treatment. So that's the first one. The second one is Spiritually Oriented Psychotherapy for Trauma, and it's primarily for clinicians. And it's written to really address and begin to articulate that trauma is extremely dispiriting, and it's something that impacts an individual's spirituality or religiosity very often, but it may hit them at the core of their identity and how they make meaning in the world. And especially when we're talking about complex trauma, which often involves betrayal by other people and significant repercussions in terms of trusting other people and also trusting God. So we have addressed that from a variety of different perspectives. The book doesn't have a focus on Eastern religion practices. Unfortunately, maybe that's the next book to come, but I think it's a good first take at spiritual issues in how therapists can address them when they're related to trauma.
Okay, so 2 books. It's Not You. The first of which, It's Not You, It's What Happened to You. And the second, Spiritually Oriented Psychotherapy for Trauma. Awesome. Again, those will be linked up in the show notes page. Chris, what, maybe can you name 2 other kind of go-to books that, not necessarily, they don't have to be trauma related, but ones that have inspired you on your journey?
Yes, they are trauma related. The book Trauma and Recovery by Judy Herman, which was originally published in 1992. I call it the instant classic in the field. And Bessel van der Kolk's Psychological Trauma. Those were foundational books for me.
Okay, so Trauma and Recovery by Judy Herman and Bessel van der Kolk's Psychological Trauma. Awesome. Chris, you have been just so inspiring. I'm glad we finally hooked up here. I just really appreciate everything you're doing. And, you know, for me, starting out doing this, it's really an inspiration to hear someone who's had so much experience, and yet you're still doing it. You know, you're still reaching out. I mean, you're in private practice. No, I'm serious. You're in private practice, and you're you know, on the national and international stage to do what you're doing. I just think you're doing such a great service for all of us. So I just want to thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that.
And again, thanks for taking the time to do this, and we will talk soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Take good care. Bye-bye.